In this chapter, we're going to work with JavaScript objects, functions, and events. In this video in particular, we're going to begin talking about JavaScript objects and kind of take a overhead view of the objects that exist, and then we'll break them down in future videos. The first thing we're going to talk about is the host objects that we get from our browser environment. JavaScript runs inside a web browser, and the web browser is our host, and that host provides some objects that we can make use of. We've already used some of those objects. We've used the window object. The window object represents the open web browser, and it's the global object for JavaScript. We've also looked at the document object, which represents the HTML document in the browser window. We can break it down. The document object lets us work with the document object model, which is a very powerful tool, and it's really the whole reason JavaScript was designed, is to work with the documents. Some other objects that we'll work with, some other host objects that we'll work with, are the navigator objects that we can look at to help control navigation with JavaScript, and history. We can look at the history object, so we can look at the URLs that the user has visited in their web browser with the history object. Okay. So these are the objects that are provided by the host environment. Now, if you're using JavaScript somewhere else, like say Node.js, that's a different host environment, and these won't exist. But for this course, we're going to be using JavaScript within the browser environment, so we're going to make great use of these host objects. The other kind of objects are JavaScript native objects. These are the objects that are provided in JavaScript in the language itself. It's part of the ECMAScript specification that we learned about earlier. Okay. And the first one is the object. It's the base object. All JavaScript objects inherit from object. Arrays, we've already worked with arrays a little bit. That's an object that stores a collection of data. These are provided by JavaScript. JavaScript also provides a date object to store dates. And JavaScript provides a function object that helps us handle when we write functions. We make use of the function object. It's an object that stores a predefined collection of JavaScript statements. And we're going to learn to write functions. We're going to look at some later in this chapter. Now I want to skip down here to math. The math object is a utility object. It has a bunch of static methods provided to us when we're working with numbers. We can make use of the math utility object when we want to do things like take trigonometric functions or square roots or things like that. We can get that from the math object. And then these three that I kind of skipped over for a second were the number object, the string object, and the Boolean object. So number is a wrapper object for working with primitive number data types. So a number in JavaScript is a primitive object. Because it's primitive, it doesn't have its own set of methods that we can use with it. It doesn't have its own set of properties that we can look at. But the number object can wrap around a number and allow us to treat it like an object. So we can, and we'll see an example of that in the next slide. Same thing with string. String is a primitive data type in JavaScript. And because it's primitive data type, the string object is there to wrap around that string so that we can call methods and properties of the string like it, and use a string like it's an object. In some languages, strings are objects. If you've taken Java, you know in Java, strings are actually considered objects, not primitives. In JavaScript, strings are primitives, but we have the string object wrapper so that we can treat it like an object. And the same is true for Boolean. So what do I mean by a wrapper object? Let's take a look how these wrapper objects can work. And we're going to look at the number object. So if we declare a constant called pi, 3.14159, that's a primitive number. Okay, so pi is a primitive, and because it's a primitive, it doesn't have any methods. But I can still say pi, and I can call a method called toFixed. Okay. How do I look at a toFixed method on something that's a primitive? And that's where the wrapper object comes in. The number wrapper object wraps around these primitives and lets us treat them just like they were an object. And we can call a method, in this case, we're calling the toFixed method, the number object, on a primitive data type. And it just works. JavaScript takes care of that for us. So you don't really need to know anything to use them. You call their methods just like you would call them for any other object. And JavaScript automatically wraps them in the number object and allows this to work. So JavaScript's pi to a number object, so then we can call that number object's toFixed method. All right, so we talked about objects and properties and methods. All objects have properties and methods. We talked about the host object, which is usually our browser, and it will be for this course. We talked about the native object, which is the objects that is provided by the JavaScript language. We talked a little bit about wrapper objects, and we talked about utility objects like the math object.